I'm Katie Contos, and welcome to today's webinar, which is hosted by the NICE Future. Today's webinar is focused on the OECD NEA report, The True Cost of Decarbonization. Before we begin, I'll quickly go over some of the webinar features. For audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over the telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. If you choose to dial in by phone, please select the telephone option, and a box on the right side will display the telephone number and audio pin you should use to dial in. If anyone's having any technical difficulties with the webinar, you can contact the GoToWebinars help desk with the number on the screen, 888-259-3826 for assistance. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you use the questions pane where you can type it in at any time during the broadcast today. We are also recording today's presentation, and it will be added to the YouTube at the link provided on the slide, and we'll also post it later. Today's webinar is a part of the NICE Future Initiative. The NICE Future Initiative is a ministerial level initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial, completing its first year. The initiative envisions a world in which nuclear innovation and uses advanced clean energy goals. The initiative recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to energy and fosters collaboration among clean energy supporters in exploring solutions for clean and integrated systems of the future. Today's discussion touches on themes that are very important to our initiative, including the potential for non-emitting nuclear and renewable energy to work together, the economics underpinning clean energy choices, and advice to policymakers and stakeholders regarding diverse innovations and options. Our NICE Future team is currently gearing up for the next Clean Energy Ministerial mission, which we're very excited about. Mission Innovation Meetings, May 27th through the 29th this year in Vancouver, Canada. So today's discussion and inputs from our excellent panel are very timely. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Salma Bilbao y Leon, who will be moderating today. We're very fortunate to have her. Salma is the head of the Division of Nuclear Technology, Development and Economics with the Nuclear Energy Agency. And with that super brief welcome, I'd like to welcome Salma to the webinar to introduce the rest of the panel and to moderate our webinar. Salma, welcome.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to and welcome to everybody that is watching us remotely. So we have, as you have probably seen, a relatively large number of fantastic presenters today. So I'm going to very briefly introduce them so that we can actually start with the true discussions. So our first presenter will be Dr. Jan Horst Kepler, who is a senior economic advisor at the Nuclear Energy Agency, and he is one of the authors of this study. He will be making the primary presentation of the study, and then he will be followed by Dr. Marco Cometto, who is an energy economist at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and he is also one of the co-authors of the study. So we will also give him a little bit of time for him to provide his insights. So afterwards, we are going to hear some remarks and some feedback on the outcomes of the study from various presenters. We will start with Peter Fraser, who is the head of the Gas, Coal, and Power Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. And he will be followed by King Lee, who is the director of the Harmony Program at the World Nuclear Association. And we will conclude with Dr. Brent Dixon, who is the lead analyst for nuclear system analysis and integration at Idaho National Laboratory. So we really think that all these different speakers and the different points of view that they are going to bring us are going to be very good to have a good discussion and hopefully very good questions. So what I wanted to start with is, let me show you here. Hopefully everybody is seeing my slides. So before we start, I'm going to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. I think that many of you know that the role of the NEA is, we are an intergovernmental organization. We have 33 member countries that currently operate about 82% of the world installed nuclear capacity. And essentially what we try to do is to foster the international cooperation among these countries that tend to be the ones that have very mature infrastructure in nuclear energy, so that we can increase the safety and the cost effectiveness of nuclear technology. So the areas of work that we have at the NEA go all the way from safety, radioactive waste management, decommissioning, radiological protection, law, nuclear science, and of course, technical development and economic studies, which is the division that I head. So I'm going to stop here, and in the interest of time, let me go to Jan's presentation, and I'm going to welcome Jan, and he's going to present the work that we are doing.
Yes, thank you very much, Sama. Thank you very much, Katie. It's a great pleasure here to discuss with you about the new OECD NEA study on the costs of decarbonization, a study that was prepared together with Marco. It's part of the ongoing work here at the OECD NEA. We had a study in 2012 on first study on system costs, as we call it. Then we had a study on nuclear new build in 2015, the projected cost series, of which we're preparing together with Peter, a new series for 2020. And we had the full cost of electricity provision and a paper on sustainable development last year. This is a study about system costs. You're, of course, all familiar with the plant level production costs, which are the LCOE costs, the levelized costs of electricity. And most of you will also be familiar with sort of the external costs, full costs or social costs, things like pollution, climate change, security of supply. System costs are of a different nature. System costs are real monetary costs that accrue at the level of the electricity system that's connected by the grid. And the difference with the plant level cost is only that it's being paid not by the plants that are causing it, but by the different members of the electricity system that are connected to the same grid. Now, our study is looking at system cost, the cost of producing electricity in a given electricity system, under a very strong carbon constraint. The carbon constraint that we are looking at is 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and is roughly consistent with what is needed under the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says that we should hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius. That would translate into greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere to about 450 ppms of CO2 equivalent. With some calculations that we're not reproducing here, annual CO2 emissions would then have to be reduced by 43% at the global level, or 61% in OECD countries. Given that electricity produces about 40% of global CO2 emissions and is expected to contribute over proportionally to that reduction, annual emissions from electricity would need to decline by 73% globally and by 85% at the level of OECD countries. That's a big decrease from 100% to 15%. And it basically, or it does mean that from the current emission intensity of 570 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour at the global level, or 430 grams of CO2 in OECD countries, we need to go down to 50 grams of CO2, either divide by 10 globally or divide by roughly 4 in OECD countries. You are all familiar with the fact that, in fact, hydro resources are limited. And so the only way to go is either renewables, of which the most important are wind and solar PV, which we call variable renewable energies, VRE, or nuclear energy. Those two groups of energy will need to substitute for fossil fuels, such as coal, gas, or oil. We analyze different electricity systems, all with the same carbon constraint of 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, but with different shares of nuclear and of renewables. And in particular, we then look at how does the system react to the fact that with high shares of renewables, you will have a lot of variability in their production in the system, and what that does do to the remainder of the system. Talking about these system costs, why are systems with variable resources more expensive than systems without such resources? Well, let's look in this slide first to number 2 and 3, which are slightly more obvious. First of all, variable resources are often uncertain. So you don't know exactly what the production will be in the half hour ahead. So we need some dispatchable plants that cycle, that are basically there just to sort of, they basically turn at 50% of their capacity. So they can easily then sort of increase their capacity in case that there should be sort of a shortfall in renewable production. We also have larger network costs, both for the transmission system and the distribution system. With variable resources being more dispersed, often being distant from the load centers where the consumption is, these costs will also go up if their share rises. But by far the largest share of system costs are the profile costs. These profile costs are directly due to the variability, not the uncertainty, but the variability of renewable production. How do we need to think about that? Well, renewables, even if you may say sort of on average costs, they're similar, comparable, slightly higher, slightly lower than dispatchable resources, they're variable. So we need dispatchable resources for the time when the renewables, the variable renewables are not available. That's a residual system. That residual system, however, will have to have a certain amount of capacity to be always there. That capacity, however, works a lower number of hours, Same capacity, lower number of hours, which means the average cost of the system, of the residual system goes up, the more the variable portion or the more the renewable portion is indeed variable. Those are the profile costs, and they are an increasingly important part of total system costs. Let me quickly show what we did, 8 scenarios that we presented. A base case, least cost option, then we have a case with 10% variable renewables, 30% variable renewables, 50% variable renewables, and 75. Then we have 2 sensitivity studies, sensitivity cases, one without interconnections, one without interconnections and without hydro. Why is that? Because both interconnections and hydro provide flexibility to the system. And the more flexibility resources you have in the system, the easier you can absorb, in fact, the variability of the renewables. So that does make a difference. The more flexibility they have, the lower will be the system costs and the total cost of the system. And then we have a case, the green case, that becomes more and more important, sort of the way we think about it. That's a low renewable cost case. In the green case, we do have some renewables coming in on their own merits because they do have lower plant level costs than nuclear, for instance. However, due to the system cost, there will be some sort of arbitrage at the margin, and we will have, in the least cost case, both variable renewables and nuclear that sort of then balance each other. I'll come back to that at the very end of my remarks. Let us quickly develop a little bit of intuition what happens if you do have a lot of renewables in your system. You have here over the 8,760 hours of the year, the load curve, and you have in red the consumption of total electricity minus hydroelectricity that's produced anyway, that's always running. So the red curve is pretty much what is consumed. And then we reduce from the red curve the production by wind and solar PV, and we get the blue curve. And you see with 10% variable renewables, the structure of the curve is very similar. It's basically sort of a downward translation, and nothing much happens to the structure of the system. You have 30% renewables. Well, you already start seeing that it's becoming a little bit different. The ramps are getting higher for the residual system, and you also have some hours where it's actually hitting zero, which basically means you don't need any dispatchable production. And these are the hours where you actually will also have zero prices. That's what's already happening in a number of countries around the world, 30% contribution by wind and solar PV, and quite a number of zero price hours. That increases quite dramatically with 50 and 75% of variable renewables in the system. And managing the system is now becoming a lot more difficult. You have very steep ramps. There will be a lot of stress on technology. This is something we couldn't model. Our model is an economic model. But nevertheless, there will be, in practical terms, a lot of technical stress in addition to the economic costs that we actually did model. And you see that the traditional seasonal, weekly, and daily pattern of the electricity load is actually being completely destructured. You have a lot of excess production at certain hours, which needs to be curtailed. To some extent, you may export it in some systems, but in many systems it will need to be curtailed. And residual production is indeed getting less and less. However, capacity is still needed for those hours where variable production will fall short. Now we're coming to the results. On the left, you see results in terms of capacity. On the left, we have the base case with only nuclear production, because in our assumptions based on 2015 data, there was only nuclear in the least cost case. Then we have the case where it's 10, 30, 50, and 75% renewables, and you see that the capacity is going up dramatically. That, of course, has then impacts on land use in particular, but also in terms of cost. We'll get to that in the next slide. In terms of generation, it's pretty much what you would expect. The more you add renewables to the system, the more will be renewable production. That's logical. Nuclear will decline in the same pattern. The more renewables you have, the less nuclear you have. That's defined by the carbon constraint of 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And the share of gas is defined by the same constraint, by the same carbon constraint. So that stays pretty much the same. Production by combined cycle gas turbines and open cycle gas turbines. However, as we move towards the 75% case, the share of open cycle gas turbines, because they're more flexible, have lower capital costs, will actually increase at the expense of the combined cycle gas turbines. I'm coming now to what is probably the two most important slides of our research, of our study. The total costs of the whole system to respond to a given demand. There's something I should have mentioned right away. Demand in all 8 cases is always exactly the same. So the question is only, how do we actually satisfy that demand at the same carbon constraint with different shares of renewables and nuclear? And you see here that the average cost of a megawatt hour in the base case is about $67 per megawatt hour, and it rises to about $130 per megawatt hour in the 75% renewables case. That increase is a result of different forces. To some extent, at least with the assumptions used, it's due to an increase in LCOE costs, which you see in green. So just plant level costs is getting more. You also have an increase in grid costs in blue, in balancing costs in light blue, connection costs in gray. All that's pretty intuitive. What's interesting is the red part, which are these famous profile costs, that the restructuring of the system will cause total system costs to go up. Basically, think about it in terms of backup capacity that's required for a lower number of hours now. And instead, of course, renewables coming in. You can also look at the same information in a slightly different way. You can break it down in terms of megawatt hours produced by variable renewables, megawatt hour VRE, as we call it. And there you see that per megawatt hour produced by wind or solar, you have added costs to the system, about $8 per megawatt hour of renewable in the 10% case, going up to $50 per megawatt hour of renewables in the 75% case. And that's the correct way of thinking about this. If you have 75% renewables in your system, and you look at the cost of those renewables and say they may be, I don't know, $70 per megawatt hour in terms to get at the cost for the system, you need to add those $50 per megawatt hour VRE to arrive at 120, which you then would need to compare to the cost of a dispatchable resource that is not variable. Two different ways of thinking about that increase in system costs. I'll be very quick with the remainder of our slides. This is actually a slide that's not from a study, but it's nevertheless very interesting. It's from a study or related to a study that's done by MIT on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world that came out in September 2018. And we worked very closely together with the same team that did the modeling for that study, Sepulveda, who's mentioned here as a source. But that's not the point. It's a good occasion to mention the modeling team that we worked with. But the key point is here on the left side. Our study has a carbon constraint of 50 grams per megawatt hour. The slide here shows what happens if you go down to 25 or even 1 gram per megawatt hour, sort of really near total decarbonization. Then you see how these costs really increase exponentially. And they do so in particular if you try to achieve that goal, if you, in this sort of Z-axis, you move from all nuclear system to an all renewable system. And then you get really, really, really very, very high costs, up to $300 per megawatt hour of electricity, if you want to have total decarbonization with a system that provides it only with renewables. So that's an interesting point, sort of in sort of framing what we are doing. We're somewhere in the middle of that approach there. Let me go on. Low duration curves is pretty much already what I described to you. You see in black what's happening in the system in the base case, the black line at the top, and at the bottom, the red case in the 75% case. That's a low duration curve as seen by a producer with dispatchable technology. And you see that the hours are getting less and less and less. We also see on the right side that price volatility increases enormously. With 75% renewables, we have up to 3,750 hours of zero price hours. Given that we have a profitability constraint in our system, which is normal, otherwise the technology would leave, this will be compensated by a high number of high price hours. So the volatility of the total system will go up a lot, and possibly the cost of capital will go up because of that, because the risk is so much higher. Again, that's something that's not modeled. Our cost of capital is the same in all the different scenarios, but it would be something to sort of think about, at least in a qualitative way. I'll, in the interest of time, be very quick here. We have increasing demand on the flexibility of nuclear power plants. In the base case, it's a blue line at the top. There's a little bit demanded in terms of load following from nuclear. As you move down, you have less and less capacity, but more and more variability demanded. And in the 50% case, you see that nuclear needs to load follow very quickly. There's no nuclear in the 70%, even the 75% case. For gas, you see that for open cycle gas turbines, it's actually getting more as you move for higher capacity with the 75% case in yellow, pretty much same variability for the 50 and the 75% case. And for combined cycle at the right, it's pretty much the same in all the different scenarios. Let me rest a minute on the final slide of our results. On the left side, that's actually something that will interest the economists quite a bit. It shows you the declining market value of variable renewables as you increase their share. How can that happen? Why does a megawatt hour, or a megawatt rather, a megawatt of solar or wind earn less than the average market price? This is due to a phenomenon that we call autocorrelation. All the wind turbines turn during a restricted number of hours, and during those hours, they drive the price down. For solar, it's even more obvious. You basically have good solar from 10 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And during those hours, all the solar panels are working and prices fall. And that's what they earn. And so in a completely competitive market, these curves will look like that. That's another proxy for system costs, because it's related also to the variability. Now look, I promised you to come back to the low cost renewables case on the right. The base case is the left column. The low cost renewable case is the right column. Due to the now much lower costs of renewables, we do have endogenous entry of renewables. No longer any constraints, no longer any subsidies. They come in on their own merits. But with their system costs rising and with their market value declining, at a certain point, nuclear comes in again, also on its own merits. So the least cost version is now a case in which we have renewable as a low cost option, but variable, and nuclear slightly higher cost, but dispatchable, coming in there, and both of them providing the low carbon technology together. Our study, but this is more sort of in the interest of time, sort of a plea for you to read it. We have a number of policy recommendations, carbon pricing, investment for low carbon technologies by providing stability for investors, staying with short-term markets, adequate levels of capacity and flexibility, allocate system costs. You'll look at that at home. This is what I said. This is a synthesis. You can look at the slides later. Just recalling what we did, recapping what we did. Study is working very well. We have quite a number of presentations all over the world today with you, and we're very much happy about that. And there is one take-home message which we would all like you to take home, that radically decarbonized electricity systems will rely on variable renewables and nuclear energy as their two main pillars, and that economic system cost analysis is the keystone that will allow to identify opportunities and challenges, as well as to organize their complementarities into a coherent whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. So now I would like to invite Marco to provide his comments to the study.
Thank you very much, Sama, for your introduction, and thank you, Jan, for your very good and comprehensive presentation and introduction to the study. It is really my pleasure to be part of this panel, of this webinar, and I'll try to give some complementary view to that has been said by Jan. Overall, I think that there are many factors that have an impact on what is the optimal combination of generation technology and ultimately the cost of decarbonization. Jan mentioned some of them. Each country is different. The electricity demand profile, its correlation with variable renewable generation, the availability of hydroelectric storage is quite important, as well as the size of the system. Those vary among different countries, among different systems. One other point that was mentioned by Jan, clearly the carbon constraint to be achieved is also an important factor on the optimal mix and on the cost of decarbonization. We don't have to forget also there will be technological progress and cost reduction. I'm thinking about storage technology, demand-side measures, and flexibility of all conventional generation. All those will have a big impact on the future cost and on the future system. Finally, the cost evolution of low-carbon technology, either nuclear or renewables, are also a key element for the future system. One other aspect that will shape the future system and the future cost is, and I see an increase in the interdependency of the power sector, which has been modeled in our exercise, with the global energy and transport sector and transport sectors. Here, I'm really thinking at the future heat market, at the electrification of transport, which will also be decarbonized. Clearly, we cannot predict what will be the evolution of those factors, and each of them will have an impact on the results. But however, I want to stress here that this study allows to draw some important conclusions which are generic, which go well beyond the specific power system that has been modeled and of the cost hypothesis that has been taken into the analysis. And the two key points here to me are, the first of all is that achieving a target of 50 grams per kilowatt hour is extremely ambitious. And really it represents a formidable challenge for the whole power sector. Achieving even the most stringent target that are required beyond 2050 will be more and more difficult. The second point was also mentioned by Jan before. Expanding further the share of variable renewables in the system becomes not only technically more challenging, but also more costly from an economic viewpoint. And the key result of the study, in my view, is that the system cost of variable renewables increase significantly with their generation share. And Jan explained quite well the phenomena behind this effect, which is basically the autocorrelation of variable renewable production pattern. I would say that those conclusions are also supported by current experience in many countries that sees that adding new variable renewable capacity becomes more and more challenging despite all the progress that have been made. Now, if I want to shift a little bit on a different direction, on a direction more on policy, I would say that really, if the society wants to achieve the climate targets embedded in the Paris Agreement, that requires massive investment in both generation and transmission. The last WEO study from the International Energy Agency calculates that investment in the power sector are of the order of $1 trillion per year until 2040. That's huge. And I would like to say here that the transition to a low carbon system has a profound implication on the cost structure of the power generation mix. This is natural because all low carbon technology have the same economical characteristics. They are characterized by high capital cost and low fuel and variable cost. So whatever is the technological choice that is made, a low carbon generation mix will be inevitably more capital intensive than the current mix. And that has a big impact for investors in the power sectors, because there is a significant increase in the market risk faced by investors. And the cost of generation project. The increased volatility that Jan showed in one of the slides, the increased volatility of electricity price, is exactly one effect of this increased capital intensities of the system. And to me, the key question here is how to finance this transition, and what are the appropriate policy to encourage investment in low carbon technologies. In my view, there are three key elements. The first one is clearly carbon price. If CO2 is an externality, it should be taxed. But probably it will not be sufficient. And to a certain extent, policymakers have to balance two factors. They have to guarantee some form of revenue certainty to low carbon generation on one end, but on the other hand, they have to ensure that there is a real competition between technologies, and that the technology that provides the maximal value for the system is effectively selected by investors. And this is quite challenging. So to conclude my small speech, I would like somehow to underline 2 points. The first one, really, the challenges associated with decarbonization are enormous, and in my view, often they are underestimated by policymakers. It requires really a complete radical change from the current system to a new system in a very short time. And the second big point echoes what Jan says. Really, if we want to achieve decarbonization and maintain an efficient, reliable, diversified power generation mix as the one that we have now, really all available low carbon generation sources should be used. Variable renewables, wind and solar, hydroelectric resources were available, and dispatchable technology such as nuclear power and fossil fuel technologies if carbon capture materializes. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for your comments. So now I would like to invite Peter Fraser to please provide some comments to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Sama, and good day, everybody. I'm with the International Energy Agency, where I'm head of the gas, coal, and power markets division. So as you can anticipate, I cover a pretty wide swath of energy questions. And certainly to create a low carbon energy system will require a wide range of low carbon technologies, has been emphasized earlier. And every year we look at a suite of 38 different low carbon technologies, both on the supply and the demand side, in our Tracking Clean Energy Progress. And out of those 38, we only find that 4 are on track, one of which is solar PV. And it's clear to us that the world is certainly not decarbonizing at the rate that we need to get on a sustainable path. That was underscored quite recently with our recent assessment of the 2018 energy-related CO2 emissions, which saw yet another increase in emissions, despite seeing also a record addition of renewable generation of about 450 terawatt hours of extra renewable electricity. It's clear that we're not on a good track, and certainly one of the reasons we're not on a good track is nuclear, which in the past was one of the technologies that helped decarbonize reduce, let's say, the carbon content of a much smaller global energy system, is far off track. And we are concerned that absent government action, nuclear, particularly in the advanced economies, could be far lower than even we anticipate in our scenarios, where we're actually counting on, especially in our low carbon scenario, nuclear power to increase. For that reason, we are preparing a report which is going to be launched at the Clean Energy Ministerial, along with nice work, a report called Nuclear Power in a Clean Energy System, which is we're going to focus on nuclear power in the advanced economies, the situation today, both in terms of existing plants and their competitiveness and their ability to stay afloat, and also the prospects for new build. And we'll be also touching on some of the new technologies, which of course our counterparts on the Nice Future will be doing much more. In that report, we're going to actually look at a scenario not unlike the high VRE scenarios that have been referred to here, where we actually look at a case in advanced economies where nuclear plants, instead of being life extended, are actually closing instead. And as a consequence, by 2040, nuclear in the advanced economies drops by about 2/3 from today's levels. That has some interesting implications for integration of a higher level of renewables, particularly if you're trying to maintain the low carbon constraint. As I said, the report will be launched in just over a month's time, and I hope you have a chance to look at it. Certainly one of the issues we deal with in that report and elsewhere is the question of the flexibility of power systems. It's clear to all of us, I think, that the share of variable renewables is going to increase. And as Jan referred to earlier, in some countries or in some jurisdictions, it's already getting to levels at which systems have already got to be re-engineered to manage the larger shares that they're seeing. It will be one of the key challenges to create a secure power system and secure energy system. So we're doing a lot of work in this area as well, both on the sources of flexibility through our series called Power System Transformation, where we looked at, for example, last year, the flexibility that could be tapped into from coal plants. And of course, the flexibility from the VREs, from the variable renewables themselves, which is subject to an upcoming report, which we'll also be launching at the Clean Energy Ministerial. Another area we're looking at, which we think could be a key source, is hydrogen. It's certainly something that's becoming a popular topic again. It's certainly an area where nuclear has a role as well. And we're going to be launching a major report on hydrogen at the G20 meeting coming up in Japan in June. We're also, of course, looking at the question in the context of the long-term scenarios, and we're doing various analyses on that, both in China and also having a look at France right now, in providing some advice on the technical capabilities there. Finally, I'd just like to mention something that I think Marco touched on it a bit, and I think Brent might touch on it later on, which is the recognition of the declining value of, say, wind or solar as you increase the share due to autocorrelation. Suggests that you have to start thinking about what the value of the wind and the solar or of other variable renewables are providing to the system. And in last year's World Energy Outlook, we presented a new way of thinking about this, really a new tool. It's not something that solves all problems, what we call the value adjusted levelized cost of energy. And it's something that helps you answer, say, one simple question, which is that what's the instead of just asking what the cost, say, of a solar farm is, what's the cost or the value of the solar farm if you add batteries to it, or some other form of storage. From a levelized cost of energy point of view, of course, that's a nonsense question because batteries just add cost, they don't produce energy. But it makes all the difference when you start thinking about the value. And so you can use a tool like this to really start to understand and probe how you could change the incentives when it comes to buying renewables in terms of if you have a power purchase agreement or sending the right price signals in the marketplace to actually getting a more efficient addition of renewables as the shares start to increase, and perhaps easing the integration and increasing the cost effectiveness of doing so. So I think that is turning out to be a useful tool, and of course I believe both Marco and myself are involved in a beyond LCOE work that's being done for DOE We're serving on the advisory board. And I think that's certainly also a direction that I'm glad to see that several bodies are taking an interest in. So thank you, and I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now I would like to invite King to provide his comments to our report.
Thank you for inviting the World Nuclear Association in this seminar and to comment on the NEA very important study. To start with, I would like to highlight the challenge and the recent IPCC 1.5 degree report, which shows that nuclear is essential to achieve decarbonisation. The report also illustrates the mix of energy that will be needed in the future and the challenge for decarbonisation. In the middle of the road scenario, P3, it shows that nuclear would need to increase 6 times of its current level by 2050, and non-biomass renewable like hydro, solar, and wind will need to increase by nearly 900% from 2010's level. As it's already been commented by a number of people, that illustrates the challenge ahead. And regarding the electricity mix, as shown in the pie chart here, nuclear would have to generate 25% of the electricity in 2050. So, we're trying to move this slide, so okay. I would like to perhaps highlight some of the non-financial aspect associated with the study and some of the issues for further consideration, such as technology availability. There's no doubt in order to fully decarbonize this system, new technology will be required, and new technology will be required to integrate renewable into the system. So we need to consider the potential risk. Would those technology be available in time and at the right costs? The other consideration is from a sustainability point of view. What are the impact on material use and land use, as a number of people have highlighted? And we need to look at really the life cycle assessment of the energy system so that we can understand the potential impact. We all know that for future development of nuclear power, we will rely on political and public support. But in order to deploy a large amount of renewable, that public acceptability may also be a factor, in particular with the associated grid development as well. So these are some of the factors that will also should be looked at. So to meet the growing demand for clean and reliable low carbon mix, the nuclear industry have developed the Harmony program with a goal of nuclear energy generating 25% of electricity by 2050. So to meet the Harmony goal, we will need to build about 1,000 gigawatt of new nuclear capacity. The Harmony program is coordinated by the World Nuclear Association, and for further information can be found on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for your comments. So, and I want to close with Brent Dixon, that is going to provide the last set of comments before we open it for a couple of quick questions.
Hello, Brent. It appears that you're still on mute.
There, that's better. Okay, what I wanted to talk about briefly was a new project within the U.S. Department of Energy that parallels a lot of these other efforts called Beyond the Levelized Cost of Electricity. And this project is looking at the general problem of it's very easy to measure the levelized cost of electricity independent of the system that it's being applied to. All you need to do is be able to estimate the capacity factor, how much you will be utilizing your system to produce energy, and beyond that, all of the parameters are independent of the system. So it's a quite easy calculation. On the other hand, identifying the value of the electricity is a very difficult proposition. It depends on where you are in the system, when you are in the system, what else is being generated at the time, what the demand is at the time, and there are other values beyond just the electricity itself. For example, contribution to capacity reserves, a number of ancillary services, spinning reserves, frequency response, etc. Some of these right now are taken for granted. For example, rotational inertia. We have in most systems an excess of what's needed for being able to manage frequency and voltage. However, in some systems, as they are evolving with more variable renewable energy, there are times of the day when most of the electricity is being produced by the VREs, and some of these ancillary services may come up short. The markets today tend to only include a few of these factors and not all of them. So the markets are imperfect. The approach that we're taking in the Beyond LCOE effort is to first look at an ideal model of everything that you could theoretically include, and then start to talk about, well, but what's the practical application of that ideal model? There are difficulties in identifying and modeling the ancillary services, in modeling the variability of the system, especially for rare events. Uncertainty is typically not included in these models. Typically what we do is we run a few different scenarios, as has been shown in the first presentation today. And so you don't really get an idea of how much uncertainty there are, especially in these forward projections. And that's one of the things that we want to look at. We are keeping the scope of the effort focused on the power sector only. And some people, when they hear Beyond LCOE, they start to think beyond the power system itself to include environmental impacts such as carbon emissions, economic impacts such as jobs produced, things like that. Those are outside of our scope, just to make our scope tractable. Also outside of the scope are subsidies and policies, and that's important. The main objective of the effort is to inform on research for how to improve the value of technologies, but the capabilities that are developed should also be able to inform on how to reduce the cost of the total electrical system, including There may be information there to help inform the markets on different ways to capture some of these additional values that are currently not captured but will become more important in the future. Also, it could help with policy development because some policies are helpful to a point, and then beyond that point they may actually become hurtful. There's a problem as you develop too much of one technology, it may start to cannibalize other clean technologies, and we're seeing that in the US where larger shares of variable renewables are challenging baseload power, and nuclear is primarily baseload in the US. There's also some hydro that's treated as baseload in the US to maintain river flows, and that baseload is being challenged by negative prices during certain times of the day within certain markets caused by an excess of production from the variable renewables. And understanding some of these factors and how they interplay and being able to make them more visible to everybody should help in basically improving the overall treatment of the markets, the overall treatment of the electrical system, and how we can work to reduce the overall cost while maintaining the reliability and the resiliency of the electrical system. This effort is being paid for by the three main applied energy offices within the Department of Energy, the renewable energy office, the fossil energy office, and the nuclear energy office. It's part of a larger effort called the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, and you can see on your screen that there are a number of participants in this larger effort.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brent. So unfortunately, because all our presenters had fantastic comments and very insightful remarks, I am afraid that we are not going to have a lot of time for questions. But I would like to make sure that, so we will provide our colleagues in NEA's future the information of all the presenters, and we are very much happy to answer any questions by email that any of the attendees of this panel may have. Of course, this study is available in the NEA website, so you can download it, read it more slowly, and perhaps some of your questions may be answered that way. So with that, I think I am just going to have a couple of final comments that I think that hopefully summarize a little bit the spirit of this study. So the first thing that I wanted to emphasize, which has been emphasized by several of the presenters, is that the ultimate goal of the work that we are trying to do is to achieve decarbonization. And in order to achieve that, we see more and more that all generation technologies are going to be necessary. So that is one of the key messages. But another key message is we also need to be conscious of the capabilities and the features of the different technologies and design energy, and optimize the design of the current energy systems so that they continue to be reliable and resilient, and they are going to be cost effective while still maintaining or increasing the amount of carbon emissions that we reduce. It's actually having less and less carbon emissions. So this means, of course, that policymakers and decision makers are going to need to consider how to optimize our current systems, whether it is including technology, including more investment, and also including appropriate policies. And with this, I think I'm going to get it back to Katie so you can close.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And as Sama said, for any questions that we didn't get to today, we will connect with those attendees offline after the webinar. I'd like to extend a thank you to all of our wonderful experts and panels today. It was such a wonderful group, and especially to Sama for moderating. We very much appreciate your time and hope in return there were some valuable insights that you can take away back to your ministries, departments, or organizations. Again, we'll be posting this recording of this live broadcast on the YouTube channel, where you can find other nice future initiative recordings of past webinars we've done. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at future NICE initiatives. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.